Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week I want to talk about some of the struggles around rent once again that are facing so many people. I want to focus on specifically an article that appeared in the Austin American-Statesman titled "Jobless Tenant Behind on Rent, but Austin Landlord Pays It Forward," and sort of use that as a kind of launch point to talk about, just generally the struggles that workers are going through right now, and also some of the kind of mischaracterizations that I think a lot of the media from local on up through national has sort of engaged in as they report on these types of stories. So to talk about this article, to talk about sort of rent struggles, as well as employment issues of all sorts, we are going to be joined for this episode by Sage Westbrook, who's a carpenter based in Valle and one of the kind of main people in this story. So thank you very much, Sage, for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.
Very glad to have you. So one of the things you mentioned when you responded to this article was that this article is really about you and your boyfriend, sort of like as you struggled with work, as you struggled to as with so many other people to deal with unemployment and to be able to pay rent. You were both in the same field. You are both carpenters, and yet your boyfriend was listed as sort of the main person. It basically implied to be the breadwinner, while you were listed as a quote live-in girlfriend. Even though you were again both doing this in the same line of work, and working at the same place at the time COVID hit. I'm wondering if you can just kind of tell us, first of all, what was your reaction to sort of this story being published in the way that it was?
Well, I mean, it was really messed up because the writer contacted Trey and was saying that he'd like to pick up the story and do like a more positive story in the light of all things going on. And I was on a group call with the writer. He knew I was there. He knew, like, we told him the whole story on how we met, working in a machine shop. Together, we moved out here to Del Valle and started working at a wood mill together. I mean, he knew my background. He knew that we owned the house. We worked together. We're both carpenters and we're both freelancing now. But just, because I was excited thinking like, hey, this is going to help us out. This is going to, get some more people to ask for some jobs or like little things around the house that they need us to build, all kinds of projects. I was super excited for it. And then I woke up and Trey's like, hey, I got a text from our landlord and he sent me the article because we didn't think that they would just post it without talking to us and going through everything to make sure the information was correct, which is what they should do. And I read it and I was immediately like heartbroken because I never thought that I would be kind of pushed to the side like that, especially in a place that's apparently so liberal like Austin. I did not expect them to just take me out of my position as being a blue collar worker, which is it's not a common thing for women to be there. I mean, that should be celebrated. That is a man's world, and we're constantly like pushing through that and saying, no, we can do it. And it's you get so much criticism for it. And I really, really, really salute all the women out there who are doing blue collar work because it's hard. It's every day it's hard. And then having it blasted in a newspaper article that, you're just a live-in girlfriend, pretty much living off your boyfriend in his house where he lost his job whenever like we both have the house, we both lost our job. It's just, it's very upsetting and demeaning. So, I mean, that kind of shows you where the world is, even in 2020.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, I guess I have a different lens as a journalist because like I am kind of talking to people directly about social and economic justice issues. But like, I think it's incredible the idea that any journalist would sort of go to people, talk about their professions, and then sort of write something like this, where essentially the man as the breadwinner as such, when you've talked to the people, when you know they're in the same profession, when you know they were working at the same place. And I think that is indicative, is really like, it shows as you're talking about like sort of the stereotypes of like society that people are still dealing with. And it shows, like, to me, just absolute lazy and irresponsible and sort of reckless journalism, and that need, I think, of a lot of local media to kind of always put positive spins on things, when it's like, no, there's real issues of social and economic injustice. There's real issues of people struggling right now beyond that which they really have to struggle. There's issues right here of obvious sexism here in what people's professions are assumed to be. As a woman in the field of carpentry, like, what have you had to really deal with as far as that goes? Like, how has that affected you professionally?
Oh Lord, the list goes very long, but I've faced a lot of criticism, and the easiest way, the top layer is being told you can't do it, or being underestimated, or being kind of told to just sweep all day. I had a job where I was the fastest and most precise worker in a machine shop. And then towards the end, because my boss couldn't get with me in a romantic way, he decided to make my life a living hell. And he made me sweep every day. I swept for 8 hours a day. And I would literally be sweeping a clean ground because I had nothing. I couldn't go anywhere. I mean, this was my job at the time. I was stable. I needed the money to keep my apartment. And I was really put in a corner. And then, I quit my job after that. And I had him call me going all psycho and threatening me to come back. So that's just one of the many things. Whenever I was fresh out of trade school and joined the Austin Carpenters Union, the guy who owns it laughed at me. I mean, I could point to anything in there and tell him how to use it and tell him exactly what it is by name. And I had so many skills that a lot of people don't. I mean, there's people who specialize in flooring, people who specialize in siding, rough carpentry, finished carpentry, residential carpentry. I've done all of it. I mean, I was the shop foreman the second week that I got into trade school because I know a lot and I'm very passionate about it. And he just laughed at me and put me on like a super, really, really bad contract where my boss there told me that I should quit and become a cam girl because he would definitely subscribe to that. And then it got so bad, and I told my crew what was going on, and they laughed at me and told me to toughen up. And it's every day that I had to deal with sexual harassment. And because my boss was the person doing it, I was too scared to say anything. I told my crew, and they laughed. They thought it was funny, and I was crying. I was so scared and upset. I was crying, and they didn't care. And so, there's a lot that we go through. I mean, at my last job at the mill, I was doing my supervisor's job, which I shouldn't have been doing, and I was underpaid. I was running the part of the mill that I was working in. I was the newest person there. Everyone else had been there for at least a year. I was pretty new. And I was doing his job. And then there's this guy that got put on my shift. And I guess he was trying to flirt with me, and I didn't react very well. I was just kind of like nonchalant, didn't really realize it. And then he started getting aggressive with me. And he threw he threw something at me and knocked a bunch of knives, like box cutters, on the ground, and they were open, and they sprayed like everywhere around me. And, I could have got cut with those. And I was like, why is he doing this? And he starts screaming at me. So I go to tell my boss, and my boss doesn't even reprimand him. I see him and the guy laughing together and just having a sweet old time. Didn't reprimand him at all. And then after that, I got pretty much put on the shit list, and they all just started ganging up on me. And it was just, it's a lot of unfairness. And it's something that, like, if you are being harassed, I hope that people work for good companies, but I have not worked for a single good company that will stand up for you. And even if you go to HR, you're more likely to get fired for submitting, a complaint against someone, especially if they're higher up or they're just very well liked in the company. They would rather get rid of you because apparently you're the problem for being harassed than the person doing it to you. So it's there's a lot that goes on there. And then on top of it, the pay, the wages are like so jacked up. I mean, it's bad enough it's 2020. We don't even make, on the dollar compared to men. I don't get paid the same dollar that a man does, and it's 2020. I'm allowed to work and I still don't get paid the same. Like, it's crazy. It's so crazy, and it's so frustrating too. It makes me want to give up sometimes.
Being part of the union, did you ever feel like that was helpful to you? Did you feel like there was sort of a resource you could pull from for people to defend you? Because I know that's the way unions are supposed to function. I know that unions are supposed to sort of stick up for all of their members, but I wonder if like that was ever something where you also felt like maybe the union itself like had those same sexist biases. I don't know. I'm not trying to imply that it does or doesn't. I'm just wondering from your perspective what you saw.
Yeah, I mean, I had never joined a union before. My papa and his dad had started a welders union in Jasper, Texas. So, I mean, I was like, okay, that's cool. They did that, so I'm going to do it here. And, I think it's the fact that the first day when we went to go apply that he like scoffed at me, just he looked at me like elevator looked at me and scoffed and was like, I could tell he did not believe my, my skills. And so that was very disheartening, but I pushed through it. I was like, you know what? Not everybody's going to be like that. There's got to be some good people here that don't think that way. And I really, really love the guy who contracted me. He's for Craft Corps. I do not mind saying that because I only have good things to say about him. It is not his fault what happened to me on my contract. Like, he was just the guy who put me there, and I had a completely different set of bosses while I was there. And those people were the problem, not the contractor. He was a great man. I mean, I know he could have helped me out, but I was so scared at the time, and I was very young too, so I didn't know what to do. And but yeah, to answer your question, I mean, the union definitely has a lot of sexism. There's this trip to Las Vegas that they do every year, and they try and say there's a lot of women in the union, but there's not. A majority of them work in the office, and that's nothing against office workers, but I'm saying, like, if you're going to represent the union, you need to be someone out there actually on the contracts, like doing those carpentry related jobs. And so they have this little thing that they go and do there, and like, it's pretty much to brag about that they hired women on, but they treat them like the whole time. Like, it's so weird and twisted to me that, like, so you want me to go and represent you and talk highly of you whenever you treat me badly while I'm here making you money off of these contracts. There's so many injustices there. It's crazy. It's so crazy.
I know at one point we had sort of talked in kind of other forums about like labor violations that not only you were dealing with, but that kind of all the people in a particular company were dealing with, like serious labor violations, as well as sort of safety violations leading up to COVID that led to your unemployment. I'm wondering if how much you feel that you just generally want to talk about that, like what sort of just generally the average sort of carpenter is dealing with.
Well, to take a couple steps back, I'll just kind of give you the gist of kind of what led up to COVID. So I've been on 3 different contracts. My first one, we had this place called the asbestos pit that I got sent to quite often because there's a lot of asbestos down there. And it's like this basement pretty much. And there's a lot of lead down there too. And you have to handle it. So that was very dangerous. Then my job after that, we had a gallon of liquid cyanide that nobody knew about. And when I found out about it, I was like, why is this here? We don't need this. This is extremely dangerous. So they didn't tell anyone. put it in a box somewhere, and then it got lost and nobody did anything. And I was the only one concerned about it because I'm like, a drop of this will kill you, and we have a gallon, and you're just going to leave it there? That's very strange. But at the last job I was at, I mean, it was wild. It was like a madhouse in there. I mean, the roof would catch on fire because they didn't properly clean one of the machines, and then they would lie about it and say it wasn't on fire, but I saw it on fire. And I was like, well, you know, if that fire starts going down, this machine's going to explode because it has highly flammable chemicals coming out of it. Why don't you fix the problem instead of saying, oh no, I have to go put the fire out on the roof and hide it and make sure no one sees it? And then the fact that, like, because there's laws against the amount of propane you can have in a mill like that. And every time the inspectors would come, they would rush everybody out to go and hide all the propane. And then on top of it, the machines there are so faulty, it is extremely dangerous. I mean, just the work environment itself is so unhealthy. I mean, there's stuff in the air, and they're not providing masks for people. I mean, I worked 2 months there, and in my first 2 months, nobody provided me with a respirator with the proper filters on it. So I had to go and get my own, and it still wasn't the proper one because you have to order it. I mean, it's very expensive. It filters out organic and inorganic material, which is what you need working in that environment. And they just didn't really care. They really didn't care about that. I mean, they were just like, oh, it's just your lungs. Like, who cares? You're just a body here, and we'll replace you so easily. There's so much. It's like crazy that stuff is like even open, because people have reported that company since COVID-19 started, trying to get them to shut down because it is unsanitary. I mean, that's where me and my boyfriend got sick. Like, that is where we caught it and got sick, and they still refused to shut down. And other people started getting sick, but there is still no testing. So they're just like, oh, well, we have the same symptoms, but we can't say we have it. So it's really, really sad, because that's, for a lot of people, their only source of income, and the job market for blue collar is really not that great right now.
Like I'll say over and over again, people in Austin consider themselves and their city to be such a progressive place. But if you look at how Austin is actually built, if you look at, for instance, like the construction industry, if you look at kind of like all of the major kind of blue collar industries that physically build and maintain the city of Austin, I mean, it's a horrifying mix of labor violations and whatnot. Like, it's a horrifying, really, really scenario. And it's like people don't realize that, or people just generally don't care, or they kind of abdicate themselves of responsibility because it's just Texas or whatnot. Like they consider themselves like a bright blue dot in a red state or wherever the case is. And it's like, no, these labor things that are going on, the injustices done to any sort of workers should be considered injustices that affect us all, and that we all are responsible for correcting. And I think the other part of this that I've talked about on other episodes is that, like, those people in Del Valle are providing services to Austin, a major urban area, but see none of this sort of like city services that Austin, provides. It's not that Austin really provides that much, even to those of us who live within the city limits. But like Del Valle basically provide, like, the area of Del Valle, unincorporated area just outside of Austin, like the people there provide so much to the city of Austin and are provided with basically nothing in return. Like talking about, for instance, like trying to figure out what rent protections actually extend to Del Valle is always just an absolute headache. So I know that I know that you and so many people in Del Valle have dealt with basically trying to cover rent. It's been kind of a constant struggle. And yeah, it's not even clear, I think, what the protections for so many people in Del Valle are. I'm wondering if you can talk about a little bit about like how that's played out for you, and sort of like what you're like to the degree that you were able to sort of find solutions, what solutions you were able to find.
I mean, honestly, after we got sick, we, we've been very transparent. Like, look, we missed 2 months of work because of this going on. Like, we were very, very scared. And I'm sure a lot of other people, even if they didn't get sick, I mean, if they got furloughed or were too scared to go to work, because I mean, that is a very, very valid reason not to go to work. You should be scared. It is very scary. I mean, we had it. It's terrifying. And I mean, I'm 22 years old. So if I can say that I was afraid that something was going to happen to me, I can't imagine how, anybody else felt if they were older or had a comorbidity or anything like that. I mean, just the average person gets extremely sick. So, it's a scary time. And I think that should be something that a lot more people are understanding about, instead of just be like, oh, you don't have the money? Well, get out of here. I'm going to kick you out during a pandemic. Like that's so terrible. And, there's a lot of stories about it. And you are right that we don't have the same kind of help that inner city Austin has, which I think isn't fair, because we already don't have the same access to things like inner city Austin does. I mean, we have to drive like 20 minutes to go to the store. That's not a Dollar General. We don't have access to like immediate health care. We have one ambulance. It's very scary, and it's just like, it kind of opens your eyes to the reality of the world you live in, because it's like, well, we're kind of off to the side. Nobody can really see us, so we really don't matter. Like, we're not going to help you guys. You're too far away. Like, no, we're still considered Austin. We should still have the same rights. And I mean, when it comes to looking for, aid from Austin, little communities and stuff like that, they're kind of just telling us like, well, we don't know what to do. I mean, we can't really help you with that. We're only doing stuff for, the Austin area. You're not considered that, so we really can't do anything. And it's very disheartening, because I mean, we need it. We deserve it. I mean, just like everyone deserves it. I mean, it's sad, It's just crazy how people just don't really care if it's not in front of them.
Yeah. And just for a little bit of context on this, in our last couple minutes, I had Richard Franklin, who's a community organizer in Del Valle, on the show recently, and to talk about specifically the fight to get a single health clinic there in Del Valle. Richard and others within a community coalition were fighting for basically a decade to get any sort of health services provided to Del Valle, which, as you mentioned, is a food desert. There are so many food deserts across the U.S., and especially in rural areas of the American South. So Del Valle is a food desert. Del Valle has basically no sort of health services. And so there was a basically decade-long fight to get Del Valle a community health clinic. And when it finally was installed earlier, I think either late last year or earlier this year, late 2019 or early 2020, when COVID hit, it was one of the first clinics to close, because they said they didn't have the PPE. Now, of course, I'm all for make sure all of the medical workers are protected, but you also have to be fair about where you're going to close and where you're going to direct your PPE. And when your first instinct, not only with Del Valle, but for a lot of East Austin too, is to just pull resources from already underfunded, quote unquote, underserved communities and bring it back to kind of the richer areas and whatnot. That's an injustice, and people need to be held accountable for that as well. So there's so much to this story I'd like to continue covering, but we have a couple minutes left. Is there anything else that we didn't kind of hit on that you feel that people kind of need to know about your situation? Again, we're talking about the Austin Statesman article, or Austin American-Statesman article, quote unquote, jobless tenant left or behind on rent, but Austin landlord pays it forward. And we're trying to clear up some of the inaccuracies of that article. We're talking with Sage Westbrook. Anything else you'd like people to know in our last minute or two?
I mean, I'm going to leave you with this little bit of information. Speaking of the article, I did end up getting in contact with the writer, and he refused to change it. So just sit on that. Like, that right there should just tell you that this little group we're working with is in a very honest group of people. And I've had a couple of my mother's friends, because I told my mom, of course, and they wrote to the Austin Statesman and said, hey, how do you think that she would feel reading this, knowing that she's also in the same trade, is also going through the same problems as Trey is? How do you think that that's fair? And no word from them. I've tried calling them. no word. They will not answer. I think they have figured out my phone number from the writer. But yeah, so just gonna leave y'all with that. Just so you know, like don't trust that because it's doing stuff like this to people, and it caused a lot of problems between my landlord and us, obviously, because the article said we were about to move out, which we were not. And our landlord's like, hey, since you're about to move out, let's start showing the house. And we're like, no, don't do that. No, that's not what we said. So it just caused a lot more problems in my life that I don't need right now, by putting out false information and kind of like misconstruing everybody's like their role in this whole situation. It was just so like out of whack and incorrect.
Yeah, it's a mess. Clearly, the Statesman is a mess right now. I hate to just openly trash too much media, but a lot of my show is media criticism. A lot of a lot of this stuff is kind of the inaccuracies of the media. For those people who might not know, the Austin American-Statesman, the Austin American-Statesman was sold to Gatehouse Media in 2018. Gatehouse Media is notorious for buying up local newspapers and sort of gutting them of all of their like hard-hitting content and turning them into like a sort of cheap content mills or whatnot. So unfortunately, that's the state of a lot of local media. As important as local papers are, if they're not going to get the stories right, what even is the point? So I think we're going to go ahead and leave this story there. We were joined for this segment by Sage Westbrook, who is a carpenter based in Del Valle, just outside the city of Austin. Thank you very much, Sage, for coming on the show.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me a voice, because I don't get that too often.
Yeah, absolutely. You are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOLP 91.7 Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. And for the second half of this show, I would like to talk about some of the mythology around China, both pre and post-COVID, even going back to sort of the early 2000s, and clear up some of the mythology around the so-called aggression of China. I think the reality of the geopolitical situation in the world right now is that, the reality is that China is not the aggressor in most of the world, but that in fact the U.S. has played the aggressive role, and that China has often acted either neutrally or often in sort of the best interest of all parties. I think we're seeing that the most with, for instance, the response to COVID, where China actually had one of the best responses in the world as far as being able to save their own citizenry, and also just for that matter, really being able to provide PPE for much of the world as well. With all this, it's really important to sort of really delve into the geopolitics of this. So there was an article for Liberation News titled "Why China is Not the Aggressor" that goes over some of the geopolitics written by Walter Smolarek. I'd like to discuss that today with Walter, who's an editor with Liberation News. So thank you very much, Walter Smolarek, for coming back on the show.
Glad to be here.
I hit upon a lot of topics there in the intro that I'd like to get into one at a time. But I'm wondering if we can start with basically like why this article is important and why it's important for those of us who are concerned about social and economic justice here in the U.S. to really be paying attention to the U.S.'s aggression in Asia and sort of the U.S. hostility toward China. Why that should be important to us.
Sure. Well, I think that this is quickly becoming a main theme, not only of international politics, but also in terms of domestic U.S. politics as well. I mean, a lot of listeners have probably seen some of the Joe Biden and or Donald Trump advertisements about how their opponent is soft on China, rolling over for the Chinese, allowing too many Chinese people to come into the country. It's clear that in the face of this extreme crisis, not just a public health crisis, but really a crisis of legitimacy for the capitalist system brought about by the pandemic, that the consensus strategy is to deflect blame to China and to try to mobilize public opinion in a way that allows the Pentagon war machine, the State Department establishment, to carry out in an even more aggressive fashion what its long-term strategy has been for quite some time, which is to encircle, contain, and ultimately enact regime change inside of China.
And it has really highlighted, I think, the difference between the Chinese response and the way sort of a socialist country or a country with sort of a socialist government or socialist leanings deals with a pandemic of a public health crisis, versus the way capitalist countries do, where the profit motive and the sort of the self-centered motive there basically led to an absolute free-for-all in sort of a grab of resources. Whereas with China, there was this sort of centralized response that allowed China to sort of analyze the problem, not blow it out of proportion. In its early phases, they were still trying to get a handle on it. First of all, quarantine people, do contact tracing and whatnot, and essentially get a handle on the crisis so that they were able to kind of head it off at the pass, whereas COVID still continues to rage. And even, essentially COVID continues to grow here in the U.S., especially in states like Texas, where that is incentivizing states to reopen prematurely. Yet China was blamed for months and months and months at the beginning of COVID for its so-called quote-unquote authoritarianism. Somehow when China instituted a quarantine, it was authoritarian, whereas when many of the capitalist countries are forced to take this sort of same policy, it's seen as somehow necessary or whatnot. It's somehow in a different category, even though China by far had the better public health response than most of the capitalist countries where most of the deaths have occurred. And for people who are interested more in that, they can check out KJ Knows research and sort of analysis of that, specifically an article called Yellow Caking an Epidemic. But I'd like to also get into some of the sort of geopolitics, because really this U.S. open hostility to China, this absolute racist, xenophobic attack, or really sort of ideological attack on all fronts against China, began long before the Trump administration, though it was Trump who kind of infamously began ramping up the China rhetoric when essentially the liberal capitalist establishment was crying at the same time, Russia. But still, even during the Obama administration, there was a so-called pivot to Asia that began increasing these hostilities. Why did the Obama administration initially make this move, or why did generally the U.S. establishment begin making these sort of aggressive and hostile moves against China during the sort of 2000s and especially during the 2010s?
Yeah, well, you're definitely right that this is a bipartisan project. It's not just a Republican or a Democratic talking point. It's something that the true professional managers of the capitalist state, of the capitalist government in the United States have settled upon. So, there was, of course, the war on terror launched in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. And even though it was sold to people as well as just that, a war on terrorism, and it was dressed up, of course, in Islamophobic rhetoric, anti-Arab racism, but that was sort of the principal focal point because the strategic goal behind that was to control the world's energy supply, and that meant making sure that the Middle East was ruled entirely, or at least in very large part, by reliable client states of the U.S. government. This was laid out pretty explicitly by a think tank called the Project for a New American Century, which then provided a lot of the core personnel for the George W. Bush administration's foreign policy and military, establishment personnel. So the war on terror was meant to be like a clean sweep through the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, but also Iran, Syria, Libya, Sudan. All of these countries were on the Pentagon's hit list, but it ended up in quagmire because the Iraqi resistance essentially prevented this plan from going forward. So by the time, Barack Obama was elected, there was a growing consensus that some way, in some face-saving way, the United States needed to reduce its involvement in the Middle East, reduce its level of intervention and aggression, and to refocus on who they view as the main, and this is the language they use, strategic competitor for the 21st century, which is China. China had been growing at an extremely rapid pace. The scale of economic development that China has enjoyed in the past several decades is, really unparalleled in modern times, or amongst the sort of greatest economic success stories. And so the large population of China, its strategic significance, the not necessarily military prowess of it, but just its ability to stand on its own 2 feet, means that could potentially form an alternative pole in world politics to the United States. So that's kind of the big picture thinking of the Pentagon and State Department, I think, like why China. So the Obama administration, and this was when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and she was sort of the ideologue of this to a great extent, began to reduce U.S. military presence in the Middle East, and instead of bringing them home, to redeploy them to the Pacific, to redeploy them to the Western Pacific, particularly where the United States has, long-standing military installations. Like in South Korea, there's about 30,000 U.S. troops. In Japan, I believe the number is about 50,000. There's a huge Air Force base on Guam, which is a U.S. colony. The Philippines, even though that status is now sort of in question, the Philippines is very important too. The giant U.S. military base on Okinawa. So basically to make this the focal point of the U.S. war machine.
I think a lot of people listening to the show already sort of understand that economics drives imperialism to some degree, but I'd like to really flesh that out of why, for instance, the U.S. empire feels this need to compete with China when in fact we have such an abundance of resources. We have, globally, we have more food than people can eat. We have more housing than people can live in, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, so the problem here does not come from a scarcity of resources. It comes from sort of this need for competition, whereas like the U.S. feels this need to constantly dominate most of the world's supply of this or that resource, whereas with more centralized systems like China's, this economically centralized system, there's not really this need to compete, to control the entire world's resources on that scale. So I think but there's this disconnect in the way that's reported. There's this disconnect in the way sort of Chinese economic deals or economic deals between China and much of the world are reported as always being somehow predatory, but the U.S. Media can never really explain how. It's always sort of implied. And I think the U.S. media generally has such an issue explaining China's economic success or the success of economic success of really any socialist country, or even the kind of social democratic countries that stand up to the U.S. They've been described as a quote unquote currency manipulator. There's a lot of kind of racist orientalist rhetoric around China somehow quote unquote cheating in the global market. But to me, that doesn't really make sense. Like that, there's no, like when you talk about China as cheating, it only really makes sense if you buy this idea that like the free market should reign supreme and that profit should come over people's lives. But anyway, what is generally behind like sort of the economic success of China? Why does China not suffer from the same boom and bust cycles that the U.S. does?
Sure. So China is undergoing a period of rapid economic development that can be traced back to the shift in economic policy that the Communist Party of China adopted basically at the beginning of the 1980s. China, the leadership of China always had two principal tasks. One was to transform the relationships between different classes in society, right? So this is sort of the tasks of socialism, abolishing the oppressor-oppressed, exploiter-exploited relationship that exists within the society. But at the same time, China was a country that was emerging from what's referred to in Chinese history as the century of humiliation, the period in which the country came under the domination of basically all of the European powers working together and carving up different parts of the country for different particular countries. So it resulted in a situation where China was very underdeveloped, was impoverished, and so the Chinese Communist Party has also always had as a principal goal the economic development of China, what Marxists might call the development of productive forces, the country's capacity to create wealth. And so the opening up of China to foreign investment in the 1980s meant that the tasks of social transformation, abolishing exploitation and oppression, took a backseat to the principal goal that was adopted, which was the rapid transformation of material conditions of the country, the transformation of the economy. And so, private capital flooded into the country, including a lot of money from the United States. Big, urban centers grew. There was a lot of, it became, China essentially became the manufacturing center of the world. And so at the same time, it's not the exact same thing as, neoliberal economics, free market fundamentalist economics. Because the Chinese government did retain its sort of central role in the direction of the economy, even though foreign capital or private capital played an extremely important role. Things like the financial sector remained under state control. The state had limits as to how much of a certain industry could be privately owned. There are goals and targets and regulations set up. The law is actually enforced in a lot of cases, unlike it is here, even if you're rich. So it was sort of a controlled capitalist economic development that resulted in significant social problems and the growth of inequality and the growth of a big capitalist class, which is sort of the danger, the inherent risk in this strategy. But it also resulted in rapid economic expansion to the point that China is now the second largest economy in the world. And so what the United States was hoping, the elite in the United States, was that as private businesses grow, that would become the base for counter-revolution, for the overthrow of the Communist Party. But that, in fact, did not happen. And so they've now, I think, pulled back to a significant degree from that older approach of sort of smothering China in the world market, and toward the more military and political, mode of military and political confrontation.
And so that has taken form in basically the U.S. backing insurrectionist movements in several different parts of the country. I think the most the most noteworthy to many people would be the so-called Hong Kong protests. The destabilization campaign there that was directly tied essentially to the, among other U.S. forces, the National Endowment for Democracy backed a lot of these protests and key figures within the so-called protest movement. And the goal there with a lot of that really was an absolute destabilization. What we weren't seeing, what we weren't hearing from the corporate media was that the so-called pro-democracy, and whenever I hear pro-democracy in U.S. media, I have no idea what it means. I've heard so many different movements, from overtly fascist movements to anarchist movements, like everywhere in between, everything along the political spectrum referred to by U.S. media as quote unquote pro-democracy. So I never have any idea what that means. But anyway, the U.S. backed the so-called pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, which were directly tied or were used as a training grounds for sort of this international network of right-wing, far right-wing kind of fascist movements such as that in Ukraine. And even some fascists within the U.S. were training sort of with the quote-unquote pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. People don't get that side of things. People don't understand how actually complex the situation in Hong Kong was. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of the way the U.S. at this particular moment in history, similar to the destabilization attempts, for instance, in Venezuela, has attempted to kind of probe at the weak spots, whether it's in Hong Kong or other parts of China, where the U.S. believes that they can sort of break off or otherwise create these flashpoints for either separatist movements or just otherwise complete proto-fascist movements.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that China, such a large country, could conceivably be controlled by outside powers is really only if it's broken up into different pieces. And so that's been a long-standing strategy of, first the British or French or Portuguese colonists, and now it's been adopted as the a principal strategy by the United States to support the dismemberment of China in the form of different secessionist movements. So like the Hong Kong protests are one such instance. Hong Kong was a direct colony of the UK. It was part of the British Empire until 1999. And so that long legacy of colonial rule has resulted in the creation of a segment of Hong Kong society that is essentially, fundamentally hostile to mainland China and who do not consider themselves to be Chinese. And so that also tends to be members of the middle classes, and so a lot of students are participating in these demonstrations that ostensibly were about an extradition law. We can get into that later if we want to, but it was actually probably a pretty good idea to have this extradition law just from a sort of pure crime fighting standpoint. But that sparked this movement that had at its core secessionist politics. Like, for instance, you could see people flying the flag of the old British colonial flag of Hong Kong at a lot of these demonstrations. Or, there were, you could find photos of thousands of people marching with U.S. flags even. So I think the political character of it is pretty clear. They don't want to be reintegrated into China. The only reason why Hong Kong is administratively separate is because of British colonialism and the fact that they didn't want to let go of this, extremely strategically and economically important colony even after the 1949 Chinese Revolution led by the Communist Party. So that's one point of dismemberment. Another is Taiwan. The only reason Taiwan is, governmentally separate from the rest of China is that was the refuge. That's where the defeated side of the Chinese Civil War found refuge in 1949 after the proclamation of the People's Republic. And so Chiang Kai-shek, the pro-U.S. right-wing dictator, managed to flee there to kind of regroup, and with the decisive backing of the U.S. military, establish kind of an enclave, a counter-revolutionary enclave there. Taiwan's technical title is the Republic of China. It's not like there's ethnic or national differences. This is purely a political distinction. Xinjiang in the northwest of China is another area where, extreme religious fundamentalist elements are getting, sort of whitewashed by the U.S. media, a lot of the other, big corporate media outlets in the West that have significant sway over global public opinion, manufacturing this narrative about concentration camps and repression, and the mass violations of civil liberties. And I don't think that there are no measures being taken by the Chinese security forces in Xinjiang. Far from it. But it's always decontextualized from the actual insurgency that is that right-wing fundamentalist groups are trying to spark there. Tibet has been not really in the news very much, but that's kind of the other source of secessionist politics within China that's been supported by the United States. In that case, it's Buddhist religious fundamentalism rather than Islamic fundamentalism.
The fight for Chinese sovereignty, the fight for true Chinese independence from this Western global domination, is essentially an anti-colonial movement, and the government of China recognizes this and really it taps into a larger Chinese cultural and social and political movement that I think long predates the Chinese Communist Party, but in the revolution there, but in fact is part of just the broader anti-colonial movement within China and within the world. So I think it's frustrating to be someone who is fighting against colonialism in so much of the world, and to see people struggle with this essentially intense propaganda campaign against China, when in fact China itself deserves the same level of sovereignty, of unconditional sovereignty, that the rest of the world's anti-colonial movements do, regardless of the contradictions within the Chinese government or Chinese society and culture. It is still ultimately not the position either of the West, these Western colonial governments, which have wreaked such havoc. I mean, how many other countries can you say have a quote unquote century of humiliation within their history because of Western colonial dominance? Many countries do, but we don't have anything to compare that to in the West. So, we need to understand that the fight against colonialism, the fight against imperialism, has to include, I think, the sovereignty of other countries, and it has to include the sovereignty of countries who are able to stand up for themselves. You can't be anti-colonial only in theory, but you have to be anti-colonial when a government like China is actually able to defend itself from these imperialist movements. We have a couple minutes left. Is there anything we didn't really hit on, or is there anything else that you feel that people just generally need to know about the situation today, from your article or just generally?
Well, sure. I mean, I think one other area that your listeners might hear about in the news is the controversy over the South China Sea. This is another supposed area of Chinese aggression. And so the United States, for instance, carries out what it calls freedom of navigation exercises in these disputed waters off of China's southern coast. So there are a number of small island chains that are disputed. China claims sovereignty over them. And then there are also neighboring countries, Vietnam, the Philippines, but several others as well, that have overlapping territorial claims. And so the way that it's presented is that it's presented in the corporate media here in the United States is that this is basically a power grab, a land grab by China trying to bully its smaller neighbors. And so the United States is sort of heroically yet again coming to the rescue with these freedom of navigation drills. But the reality is quite the opposite. I mean, there's a diplomatic process going on between China and its neighbors, which are grouped together in an international organization called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to come up with, a code of conduct about how to, deal with disputes and, to allow free shipping and the commerce to take place in these disputed waterways. But what the United States is trying to do is to actually keep this conflict alive by constantly sailing warships through these disputed areas, and also by conducting aerial patrols too. to try to drive a wedge between China and its neighbors, and also to insert itself in an area that's of extreme importance to China's economy first and foremost, but also the world economy, because such a significant section or such a significant portion of global trade passes through the South China Sea. And, if you sort of add up all of the trade that goes on in the waters of East Asia, generally, that's about 60% of the world's maritime trade. So, again, I think it's an expression of the United States' the U.S. government's desire to control world commerce, kind of the classic, 18th century mandate for the U.S. Navy. They're still doing it today.
As we were talking about, the U.S. remains the aggressor. The U.S. remains the largest obstacle to peace between China. U.S. really just remains the largest obstacle to peace right now in the world. I think just full stop there. So we'll go ahead and wrap up there. We were joined by Walter Smolarek, who is an editor with Liberation News. Walter's article titled "Why China is Not the Aggressor" was published on May 14th in Liberation News. You can find that at liberationnews.org. Thank you very much, Walter, for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.